Hey everyone, Tactics here, and with 9.1 just released and potentially a lot of new Guardian players picking up the spec, I figured I would put out a video just going over the basics, mainly when and where to use certain talents, legendaries, and conduits, as well as discuss the Covenant choice for bears. In terms of gameplay stuff, I'm not going to be going over that in this video, but I do have plenty of commentary videos over on my channel if that's what you're looking for. With that said, if you learned something, be sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel to be notified when I post more Guardian Druid content. And let's start out with a discussion on talents. I'm just going to go row by row here, guys. So starting with level 15 row, Brambles, the only damage option on this row. The other two are rage gen options, and for the most part, you're not going to be using Maul as your rage dump. So Brambles is the damage option here. Gives you a small little absorb. It's good in raids and lower difficulty dungeons, I would say, when you're not really feeling in danger and just want a little bit of extra damage. If you're in AoE situations though, or at least multi-target in some sort, and you want that defensive benefit, Blood Frenzy is definitely the way to go. It's pretty much the go-to in Mythic Plus keys. You just get so much extra rage from your Thrashes because of this. And in AoE raid fights, it's pretty solid as well. Single target, it's not too great. I would probably end up going with Brambles in single target raid fights. But anytime you can get multiple targets, it can get a lot of value, right? SLG can get a lot of value. Council can get a lot of value. It just depends on the number of targets you're able to hit. Bristling Fur here is a pretty niche pick. It definitely has uses in like a pure single target situation where you're taking heavy bursts of specifically physical damage, because again, it gives you a bunch of rage, and the only thing you can spend on mitigation for rage is Iron Fur, which only works against physical. So if you're taking heavy physical damage and you want to pump out more Iron Furs in a single target scenario, this could be the play, but generally you're not going to be using this much. And if you're not sure if you should be using this, then you probably shouldn't be using this. Moving on to this 25 row, basically two movement talents with a heal in the middle in Renewal. Tiger Dash, I've tried this out really if you ever need big bursts of movement every 45 seconds, right? Artificer kind of fit this bill, but personally I still preferred having Wild Charge over Tiger Dash in that situation. For the most part, Wild Charge will give more general value because you have the non-shapeshift version you can make use of, you have the bear or cat form charge you can make use of, and you have the leap if you're able to be outside, that kind of thing. It's really, really strong on something like Denathrius, right, where you're constantly getting knocked up or back. You can just charge right back to the boss and not be displaced very much. So it has some utility depending on the fight. Otherwise, though, Renewal is a very solid choice in Mythic Plus. Just a small little heal off the GCD that can help stabilize your HP is very, very good. If you don't need Wild Charge for raids, you can also grab Renewal for an extra little defensive, and it's just all around a pretty good general talent there. Next up, we have the Affinity rows, so Balance, Feral, and Resto Affinity. For the most part, you're going to be using Balance Affinity in dungeons. Typhoon is really good for creating some space for yourself so you can start kiting if you ever need to. If you're Night Fae, you can make use of the Boomkin Convokes, but even if you're not Night Fae, Balance Affinity combined with Heart of the Wild on the next row is a solid damage increase in dungeons as well. So in general, that's going to be the go-to in dungeons. You can run Resto Affinity in dungeons, specifically if you're making good use of your Swiftmens and you really, really need something like Ursul's for a specific pull or anything like that. But in general, I'd probably recommend going Balance Affinity. Feral Affinity, really, really good on raid fights. You can Catweave. In dungeons, you're not really going to use Feral Affinity, but again, if you can Catweave on a boss, Feral Affinity is very, very good, and Feral Convoke, if you're convoking, is very good in single target. Whereas if you're not able to Catweave, again, you're probably going Balance Affinity. The extra range is probably one of the better bonuses here, with the range, the move speed, and the passive heal. Passive heal, I wouldn't look into this too much. It looks good on meters, but in general, it's actually not helping you very much. So this benefit is really, really not much at all. You mostly have to get good use out of Swiftmens for Resto Affinity to be worth. Moving on to this 35 row. So I talked about Heart of the Wild. It is the only kind of throughput choice on this row. Because you can see there, in Balance Affinity gives you 30% extra balance damage. Similar, Feral Affinity gives you extra damage, and Crit Strikes generate an extra combo point. So it's the only talent on this row that will give you a DPS increase in both Mythic Plus and Raids. It should note for Balance Affinity, this will increase the damage of Moonfire. So even if you aren't Night Fae, you can still get damage out of this talent. You just use it and then you shift back bear form, and your Moonfire damage is just 30% higher for 45 seconds. And is generally going to be the go-to choice because, again, it is the only option on this talent row that offers damage with two utility options. These utility options are pretty solid. Mass Entanglement does have its uses situationally, specifically in a dungeon like Plaguefall. It's a very strong on several of the bosses, so it can be useful there. Mighty Bash also, stun, always good in Mythic Plus. If you pug a lot, you don't really trust your group to get all the stops, this extra stun can be very nice to have. Moving on to the 40 row, we have a couple options here. Soul of the Forest, you're generally going to avoid this talent. It's pure single target, and it's even then it loses out in pretty much every other scenario, and possibly even in single target to these other talents. So in general, you're not really going to be using this talent here. For raids, Galactic Guardian is going to be the go-to talent. It has the best overall damage of this row, especially if you're doing something like cat weaving, right? Because this can proc while you're cat weaving. You can just refresh your moonfires that way. It's also just a nice little boost to your rage gen, but if you're doing something like Mythic Plus, I would say Incarnation is probably going to be your go-to. Well, I mean, definitely going to be your go-to. Combined with Earth Warden on the next row and combined with the UFR Legendary, this makes you pretty much unkillable for 30 seconds out of every 3 minutes, which you can just plan your routes around in dungeons. And in raids, it's even usable. It's a solid defensive talent. You need tankiness during a specific window, and you aren't concerned of your safety outside of it, really. So if you want to go pure defensive in raids, Incarnation can be a good option. Otherwise, though, Galactic Guardian provides a good, decent, steady rage generation increase and some solid damage as well. This next row, again, Earth Warden, I spoke about it. Basically, your thrashes reduce the damage of auto attacks to you, and it stacks up a few times. Really good in Mythic Plus. Commonly used in raids as well if a large portion of your damage intake is auto attacks. If it's not, though, Survival of the Fittest is a really good option, reducing the CD of your Barkton and Survival Instinct, so that's your big DRs. And that's really good if your damage intake is something like magic damage, maybe bleeds, or just specific damage instances that aren't reduced by Earth Warden. A great example of this was like Sludge Fist. If you were the off tank on Sludge Fist, Earth Warden would do absolutely nothing for you, right? So Survival of the Fittest was the way to go in that situation. So it's just basically what kind of damage intake are you taking? Is it auto attacks? Earth Warden? Is it not auto attacks? Survival of the Fittest. Guardian of Elune here, it's kind of like Soul of the Forest, pretty much never picked. It's just beaten out in pretty much all situations by these other two talents here. So I would avoid this talent for the most part unless something changes. Last row, Rend and Tear is going to be your go-to in the vast majority of situations, both raids and Mythic Plus. It's the only AoE talent, so Mythic Plus there. And it helps your damage out when you're both cat weaving, when you're chicken weaving, right? This 2% stacking thrash debuff, it'll work on any form of damage, right? So if you look at Tooth and Claw, it's kind of like Guardian of Elune, where it's pretty much never worth picking. Maul still just costs way too much rage. Maybe on encounters where all of your damage intake is magic, but still, I'm just not a general fan of this talent. Pulverize, it's kind of like Bristling Fur when I talked about that initially, where it's extremely niche. It does have a use in big single target damage intake every 45-ish seconds, so very similar to Bristling Fur, as I said. But again, likely you're not going to end up needing this, and you won't use this at all. Alright, but that is it for talents. Let's move on to legendaries. Alright, legendary powers. Alright, so there's actually several options here. If you're going Mythic Plus, though, Ursoc's Fury Remembered, extra thrash chance for a little bit of extra damage, and the Absorb Shield, right? That combined with the Earth Warden, combined with the Incarn, is what makes you basically invincible in Mythic Plus for 30 seconds at a time. It also has that offensive upside, right? So it does give you a little bit of damage with that extra thrashes. It's also a bit underrated when it comes to defensive value outside of Incarn, as it really does help, even just not during those massive 30-second windows. The pure offensive version of this is kind of Lufa Infused Embrace, where it's just extra thrash damage, bigger radius, one extra stack. This is kind of your AoE damage legendary. You're speed running through low Mythic Plus keys, one extra damage. It's good on non-single target encounters in raids, particularly when you don't care about the defensiveness that Ursox provides. So if you just want to do damage in raids, you're not really scared about dying, Lufa, good option in AoE. If you're looking at single target, you've got the Draft of Deep Focus. Pure single target legendary, very good on bosses you can cat weave on, because you can get the Moonfire, Rake, and Rip uptime, which all get a damage boost from this legendary. So if you're going cat, Feral Affinity, Heart of the Wild, and Draft of Deep Focus, again on bosses you're not really worried about, you don't need the defensive value, you just want pure single target damage, this is a good legendary. Pure defensive value, we've got Natural Order as well. I think people overuse this legendary a fair bit. Again, for the most part, this is overkill a lot of times. At least one of the frenzied regens in the vast majority of situations is just pure overhealing. You normally also don't really need the extra 10% DR on Barskin. There's very, very few bosses where I'd say you'd want to wear Natural Order's Will. And again, in dungeons, Ursoc's Fury, remember, just kind of reigns supreme. So you're not going to get a spot as a legendary in a dungeon unless you're just absolutely going to get murdered by a specific tank buster, and you need this legendary. For raids, like I mentioned, very, very rare to use this. I think Denathrius on Mythic was like the only boss where people were commonly using this legendary. And outside of that, a really hard tank hitting boss, I don't think this legendary is necessary. Legacy of the Sleeper is a good PvP legendary. Not much else to say about that. It's used for RBGs for the CC immunity. I'm not going to go too far into that one, but there it is. And then we have Covenant legendaries and stuff. So let's look down at those. Most of them are not good. Not good. So Celestial Spirits, the reduced CD on Convoke. If you're boom convoking, this is a big waste because you pretty much lose your guaranteed Starfall, which was a nice portion in Mythic Plus at least, so it's not super great there. Locust Swarm gives your swarm a chance to be useful in AoE. Again, consistency problem there for tanks. You don't really want that. Sinful Hysteria, pretty decent legendary, honestly, but it has the same problem a lot of other ones do where it's not UFR, right? UFR exists, and so that kind of AoE legendary, at least in Mythic Plus, that slot is taken. So you're not going to be using this because UFR exists. Kindred Affinity actually could see being potentially useful in like some sort of simp meta for top end rating. I'll include it for completionist sake, but likely anyone watching this video, you're not going to be using this legendary. So that is that. Now, talking about legendaries, we need to also talk about domination sockets in 9.1 because it could affect how you're crafting these legendaries. So I actually have a chart here because I forget as well. So excuse the slight blurriness, but basically we care about here this leather one. So basically these green slots are ones that are guaranteed to be safe. These red ones are ones that are guaranteed to have domination sockets on them, so you want to avoid. And these yellow ones are like, if you're planning to kill the last two bosses on Mythic, you'd want to avoid these at some point, and you potentially would need to swap. But if you're not planning on killing the last two bosses on Mythic, these slots are also safe. So what does that mean? Basically, head, shoulders, chest, hands, feet. So things like draft, a lot of people currently have this on your chest. You're probably going to want to move that to your neck. Things like now, a lot of people have this on your head. It's getting a new slot. It did get a new slot in 9.1, so you want to move that to your wrist. Things like UFR, if you're raiding Mythic and you eventually kill Kel'Thuzad, you get those Kel'Thuzad legs, you'll probably then want to move UFR to, I believe it's to the back. Just things like that, basically. So this chart, I'll put this in the comments if you guys want to see it, but basically it's just mapping out the potentials of where the domination sockets cover and where you'll want to potentially craft new legendaries if you need to. In terms of how the domination sockets are looking balancing wise, I believe currently Unholy is looking like the best option for raids. For Mythic Plus, again, the bonus isn't active, so you're just going to pick up the 5 strongest gems. Likely worth dropping a little bit of eye level over, but again, that system's not fully in yet, so I'll probably address that system in a different video once we know a bit more. Hey guys, editing tactics here. Realize I didn't actually talk about stats during the video, so I just wanted to quickly address that here. So personally, I prefer targeting haste and verse. As you can see here, I'm gemming for versatility, I'm enchanting for versatility, my legendaries have haste verse on them. That's just personal preference. I like how the rotation feels with higher haste values, and of course versatility just gives some damage and makes you tankier. It's pretty good for tanks in all situations. I would be careful though for kind of falling into the trap of targeting secondary stats instead of eye level, as the combination of the agility, the armor, and the stamina increase from gaining eye level in the vast majority of cases is just better than having secondary stats that you prefer. Eye level is just king for bears with very few exceptions. Potentially jewelry, you'd be willing to drop eye level over. seeing as it only has stamina instead of agility and armor. But again, you wouldn't drop too many here. And also the new Domination socket gear. I'm sure it's likely you'll want to drop eye level to have those sockets. How much eye level, I'm not sure yet, but it's likely you'll want to drop at least a few if you can get them. Basically, what I'm saying is you can prefer a stat or two and choose that over the same eye level piece, but when presented with an eye level increase, there's a very, very high chance that the higher eye level piece is just straight up better, regardless of the secondary stats. Alright, gearing tangent over, back to the rest of the video. From there, let's talk about conduits. Conduits. Okay. So, let's just start off with finesse, because that's pretty straightforward. Born of the Wilds reduces CD of that utility row, Mighty Bash, Mass, and Takeman, Heart of the Wild. Again, when using alongside Heart of the Wild, that is a CD reduction on a damage talent, right? So that's again the only finesse option that gives you damage. So that's really nice to have if you're running Heart of the Wild. Outside of that, it's pretty much whatever you want. Born anew gives you a nice little food buff. Tireless Pursuit gives you some move speed if you're going in and out of travel or cat form a lot. Front of the Pack gives you a bigger and longer lasting Stampeding Roar. So it's all situational, what you feel there. Nothing is super impactful. In terms of defensive options, we have Layered Mane, Extra Iron Furs, always good. Nothing to complain about here. Super strong talents, especially against physical damage. Pretty much always have this one socketed. Well-Honed Instincts did get nerfed this patch. It's still very solid. Just a free frenzy to regen when you fall below 40% HP, so when you need the healing, it gives you a little bit of extra healing, and it's still a very solid talent. Innate Resolve boosts frenzied regen and regrowth healing by a decent margin. It's very good as a third endurance option, I think, and especially if you're taking a decent amount of magic damage or just not physical damage. Tough as Bark is also a solid option. It's a decent amount of CDR on your bark skin, but note you do have to be pretty much rotating your bark skin on CD or close to on CD, otherwise you start losing value out of this talent because it is just pure CDR. And also note, when paired with Survival of the Fittest, this will be reduced along with the cooldown, so you're going to get less value from this conduit if you're running Survival of the Fittest. Ursine Vigor in theory sounds interesting, but in practice it's hard to get a lot of value out of it, so I would pretty much ignore this because again you have these two which are very good in all situations, and then these two which are also pretty solid situationally, so you don't really need this 5th endurance conduit, and it just doesn't match up to the other 4. The new one, Condensed Animosphere, super underwhelming honestly. Just very tiny heal. That heal needs to be amped up a ton for it to be worthwhile. It's just not worth taking right now. Moving down to the offensive stuff. So all the Covenant Legend ones are pretty solid. Obviously here's Conflux, I have that socketed in. Deep Allegiance for Kyrian has CDR, that's pretty solid, again, especially in the Simp meta. Evolve Swarm is just extra amp for Necrolords, that's worth taking for sure. Not so good in AoE, but in single target and for cat weaving it's very good. And then Venthyr is just the adding crit to Ravenous Fury, which is also very good. Definitely something you're going to want to have, especially in Mythic Plus. The new one, Adaptive Armor Fragment, is actually pretty solid, so it's 2.8% of your agility at 200 eye level, and so that means it's a percent, so it will scale with your agility. So the better gear you have, the better this conduit is going to be. So I could see this being very good as the expansion moves on. If you look at my current agility, it's 1300. So this is going to net out at currently to like between 35 and 40 agility on a 50% uptime, seeing as it's a 15-second duration on a 30-second CD. So overall right now it's like kind of okay. Maybe a good third potency option if you have that, because Savage Combatant is terrible. But otherwise, it's not something that you would take a third potency specifically for. And I think if you'll see in a lot of cases, Soulbind's just, you're never really going to access that third potency for Guardian. So maybe in the future, but if you do have access to a third potency now, especially at higher gear levels, so maybe later in the patch, this is going to gain value as well once we're all at like 252-ish. But at least for now, I would say that it's not going to be used, but it's definitely a solid third potency option. As I mentioned, Savage Combatant is just not very good. Maul's not a good button. Don't use this. Unchecked Aggression, extremely good in Mythic Plus. It's basically a Bloodlust in your Berserk and or Incarnation. Very good. And in raid fights, which are AoE, again, very good damage boost there. From there, let's talk a little bit about Covenants. So obviously a lot of people want to know, so what is the best in slot covenant for Guardian Druids? For raids, I think that's Night Fae. They have a bit of an edge with their damage profile being burstier. Burst damage tends to be very, very valuable in raids, and being able to put out pretty consistently DPS convokes, whether you're able to cat form or cat weave or not. You're able to put out either cat convokes or chicken convokes pretty consistently in raids, regardless of what your comp is, and just gives you that extra damage boost, and it's very, very strong. Plus soul shape, extra mobility, and the blink is always nice, and they have very, very strong soul binds as well. So in raids, I would say the winner for me is Night Fae. I would say if you wanted a close second, I think Necrolord is pretty strong as well in raids. You get that extra defensive from Fleshcraft. You get that amp for cat weaving, so especially if you're able to cat weave, you can do a lot of consistent damage, but the burst damage definitely goes to Night Fae. In dungeons, I would say one of the biggest strengths of Guardian Druids is their flexibility, where they're actually able to play any of the 4 covenants without losing too much. So basically, you're able to cover whatever dungeon buff your specific group needs, if you're running with a group, that is. Most groups won't need a Night Fae. Maybe they need a Venthyr, maybe they need a Necrolord, maybe a Kyrian. You can go and cover any of those slots. All of 9.0, I was playing Necrolord Guardian Druid, covering that Necrolord buff, and it's not that big of a hit to Guardian Druid specifically, so they can play any of the 4 covenants. Obviously, some are going to be better, some are going to be worse. Like Necrolord is probably the worst in Mythic Plus, just because Adaptive Swarm does pretty much nothing. I would say Venthyr is super, super strong, because you can kind of combine that with your Incarnation and do a ton of damage. Nadia also is a very strong soul bind, especially with her new capstone once you unlock that, giving you a bunch of extra verse. So I would say pick the one that your group needs the most. If you actually are free to have the option, if you're a raider, obviously you're going to probably lean towards Night Fae then. If you're a Mythic Plus only player, honestly, Venthyr is looking very, very strong. Specifically because you always bring that Venthyr buff, and those are very, very important buffs. And frankly, if you're just doing AoE, Ravenous Frenzy plus Nadia, both very, very strong. So if you're a Mythic Plus only player, I would maybe lean towards Venthyr, whereas probably raiders are leaning a little bit towards Night Fae. That pretty much wraps up this video on Guardian Druid basics in 9.1. Again, if you guys are interested in gameplay stuff for Guardian Druid for both Mythic Raids and Mythic Plus, you can check out my channel where I have plenty of commentary videos and other guides to help you become a better bear. Or you can check me out on my Twitch channel where I stream all that stuff at Tactics. That's all for now though. Remember, if you found this video useful, be sure to leave a like and subscribe to be notified when I post more content like it, and I will see you all in the next video.